Our Lady of the Flowers by Genet. Bottom of page 196. Divinariana. Despite the abjection which you may hold her, Divine still reigns on the boulevard to a newcomer, perhaps 15 years old, in shabby linen, who winks mockingly. A pimp says, shoving her off aside, "Her, she's Divine, you're a slob." Divine has been seen at the market at about 8 in the morning. Shopping bag in hand, she was discussing the price of vegetables, violets, eggs. The afternoon of the same day, 5 friends at tea. "Behold, my darlings, behold Divine wedded to God. She rises at cock's crow to go to communion, the quite repentant." The chorus of friends, "Pita, pita for Divine." The following day, my dear, they made Divine strip at the police station. She was all bruised. She'd been biffed. Her darling's been beating her. The chorus of friends, "Ooh, Divine's getting licked." Now, the fact is that Divine wore next to her skin a clinging hair shirt unsuspected by Darling and the clients. Someone is talking to Divine. It's a soldier who wants to re-enlist. "What can I do to get along? I have no money." Divine, "Work? You can't find work right away." So he tries to tempt Divine and persists. "So?" He hopes she will answer or think, steal. But Divine dared not reply because, musing on what she would have done in such a case, she saw herself holding out to the birds her crumbs of hunger. And she thought, beg. Divine, "We have seen cyclists wrapped in the garlands of the song they whistled, going dizzily down the celestial slope of the hills. We awaited them in the valley, where they arrived in the form of little pats of mud." Divine cyclists awake in me an ancient terror. It is absolutely essential that I come back to myself, that I confide in a more direct way. I wanted to make this book out of the transposed, sublimated elements of my life as a convict. I'm afraid that it says nothing about the things that haunt me. Although I am striving for a lean style, one that shows the bone, I would like to address to you from my prison a book laden with flowers, with snow-white petticoats and blue ribbons. There is no better pastime. The world of the living is never too remote from me. I remove it as far as I can with all the means at my disposal. The world withdraws until it is only a golden point in so somber a sky that the abyss between our world and the other is such that the only real thing that remains is our grave. So I am beginning here a really dead man's existence. More and more I prune that existence. I trim it of all facts, especially the more petty ones, those which might readily remind me that the real world is spread out 20 yards away, right at the foot of the walls. Among my concerns, I rule out those most apt to remind me that they were necessitated by an established social practice. For example, tying my shoelaces with a double bow would remind me too sharply that, in the world, I used to do that to keep them from coming undone during the miles of walking I did. I don't button my fly. To do so would oblige me to check on myself again in the mirror or when I leave the can. I sing what I would never have sung out there. For example, that frightful "We're the ones who are mopey and lousy and tough," which, ever since I sang it at La Roquette when I was 15, comes to mind every time I go back to prison. I read things I would never read elsewhere, and I believe in them. The novels of Paul Féval. I believe in the world of prisons, in its reprehended practices. I accept living there as I would accept, were I dead, living in a cemetery, provided that I live there as if I were really dead. But the diversion must be based not on the difference between the occupations, but on their essence. I must do nothing clean or hygienic. Cleanliness and hygiene are of the earthly world. I must feed on the gossip of the law courts, must feed on dreams, must not be dandyish and bedeck myself with new adornments other than a tie and gloves, but must give up being smart and trim, must not want to be good-looking, must want something else, must use another kind of speech, and must think that I've been imprisoned once and for all, and for eternity. That is what is meant by building a life. Giving up Sundays, holidays, concern about the weather. I was not surprised when I discovered the practices of prisoners, the practices that make of them men on the margin of the living. Cutting up matches lengthwise, making cigarette lighters, smoking 10 to a butt, walking round and round the cell, and so on. I think that hitherto I bore that life within me secretly, and that all I needed was to be put into contact with it for it to be revealed to me from without, in its reality. But now I am afraid. The signs pursue me, and I pursue them patiently. They are bent on destroying me. Didn't I see on my way to court 7 sailors on the terrace of a cafe, questioning the stars through 7 mugs of light beer as they sat around a table that perhaps turned? Then a messenger boy on a bicycle, who was carrying a message from God to God, holding between his teeth, by the metal handle, a round lighted lantern, the flame of which, as it reddened his face, also heated it. So pure a marvel that he was unaware of being a marvel. Circles and globes haunt me, oranges, Japanese billiard balls, Venetian lanterns, juggler's hoops, the round ball of the goalkeeper who wears a jersey. I shall have to establish, to regulate, a whole internal astronomy. Fear? And what worse can happen to me than what will happen? Apart from physical suffering, I fear nothing. Morality clings to me only by a thread, yet I am afraid. Did I not suddenly realize, on the eve of the trial, that I had been awaiting that moment for 8 months, during which time I never gave it a thought? Few are the moments when I escape from horror, few the moments when I do not have a vision or some horrifying perception of human beings and events, even and especially of those commonly judged to be the most beautiful. Yesterday, in one of those narrow cells in the mousetrap where you wait until it's time to go up to the chambers of the examining magistrate, there were 12 of us, standing, crowded together. I was at the back by the latrines, near a young Italian who was laughing and relating some trivial experiences, but owing to his voice and his accent and his French, those adventures vibrated with pathos. I took him for an animal that had been metamorphosed into a man. I felt that in the presence of this privilege which I thought he possessed, he could at any given moment turn me, by his simple wish, even unexpressed, into a jackal, a fox, a guinea hen. Perhaps I was hypnotizing myself in the presence of this privilege which I thought he possessed. At one point he exchanged a few naive and mortal remarks with a child pimp. He said, among other things, "I skinned the gal." And in the narrow cell he was suddenly so close to me that I thought he wanted to love me, and so fierce that I thought he meant I skinned the woman in the sense that one says of a rabbit. I skinned it, that is, carved it up. He also said, "The warden says to me straight off, 'You're a funny egg.' And I answer back, 'Let me tell you, eggs like me are worth just as much as eggs like you.'" I think of the word egg in the mouths of babies. It's horrible. The marvelous horror was such that when I remember those moments, it had to do with crap games. It seems to me that the 2 kids were suspended in air without support, their feet off the floor, and that they were shooting remarks at each other in silence. I am so certain of remembering that they were in the air that, in spite of myself, my intelligence tries to figure out whether they didn't have some gadget that enabled them to lift themselves up. A hidden mechanism, an invisible spring under the floor, some kind of plausible device. But as nothing of the sort was possible, my memory strays into the sacred horror of the dream. Frightful moments, which I seek out, when you cannot contemplate either your body or heart without disgust. I encounter everywhere a trivial incident, seemingly innocuous, which plunges me into the foulest horror, as if I were a corpse being pursued by the corpse that I am. It's the odor of the latrines. It's the hand of the man condemned to death, the hand with its wedding ring, which I see when he puts it outside the grating of his cell to take the soup tin from the assistant. Since he himself remains invisible to me, the hand is like the hand of the god of a trick temple. And that cell, in which the light is kept on day and night, is the space-time amalgam of the anteroom of death, a vigil of arms, which will last for 45 times 24 hours. It's Darling, with his trousers down, sitting on the white enamel toilet seat. His face is contracted. When the hot lumps, suspended for a moment, drop from him, a whiff apprises me that this blonde hero was stuffed with shit. And the dream swallows me up with one gulp. It's the fleas biting me, and I know they're malicious and that they're biting me with an intelligence that at first is human and then more than human. Do you know that some poisoned poem that would burst my cell into a spray of forget-me-nots? A weapon that would kill the perfect young man who inhabits me and makes me give asylum to a whole agglomeration of animals. Swallows nest beneath his arms. They have masoned a nest there of dry earth. Snuff-colored velvet caterpillars mingle with the curls of his hair. Beneath his feet, a hive of bees and broods of asps behind his eyes. Nothing moves him. Nothing disturbs him, save little girls taking First Communions who stick out their tongues at the priest as they clasp their hands and lower their eyes. He is cold as snow. I know he's sly. Gold makes him smile faintly, but if he does smile, he has the grace of angels. What gypsy would be quick enough to rid me of him with an inevitable dagger? It takes promptness, a good eye, and a fine indifference, and the murderer would take his place. He got back this morning from a round of the dives. He saw sailors and whores, and one of the girls has left the trace of a bloody hand on his cheek. He may go far away, but he is as faithful as a pigeon. The other night, an old actress left her camellia in his buttonhole. I wanted to crumple it. The petals fell on the rug, but what rug? My cell is paved with flat stones. In big, warm, transparent drops of water. I hardly dare look at him now, for my eyes go through his crystal flesh, and all those hard angles make so many rainbows there that is why I cry. The end. It may not seem like much to you, yet this poem has relieved me. I've shot it out. Divine. By dint of saying that I'm not alive, I accept the fact that people stop thinking about me. Though Darling's personal relations had dwindled as a result of his betrayals, Divine's had increased. In her date book, famous for its oddness, where every other page was strewn with a jumble of penciled spirals, which intrigued Darling until Divine once confessed that these were the pages of cocaine days where she noted her accounts, fees, and appointments. We already read the names of the 3 mimosas. A mimosa dynasty had been reigning over the Montmartre since the triumphs of Mimosa the Great, the fluffy wuffy of high thievery. Of Queen Oriane, First Communion, Duckbill Sonia, Claret, Fatty, the Baroness, Queen of Romania, Why was she called Queen of Romania? We were once told that she had loved a king, that she was secretly in love with the King of Romania because his mustache and black hair gave him a gypsy look. That in being sodomized by one male who represented 10 million, she felt the spunk of 10 million men flowing into her, while one tool lifted her like a mast to the midst of the suns. Of Sulphuris, Monique, sweet Leo. At night they haunted narrow bars, which had not the fresh gaiety and candor of even the shadiest dance halls. They loved each other there, but in fear, in the kind of horror we experience in the most charming dream. There is a sad gaiety in our love, and though we have more wit than Sunday lovers by the water's edge, our wit attracts misfortune. Here laughter springs only from trouble. It is a cry of pain. At one of these bars, as she does every evening, Divine has placed on her head a little coronet of false pearls. She resembles the crowned eagle of the heraldists, with the sinews of her neck visible beneath the feathers of her boa. Darling is facing her. Sitting about at other tables are the mimosas, Antonia, First Communion. They are talking about dear absent friends. Judith enters, and in front of Divine bows to the ground. "Good evening, madame." "What an ass!" exclaims Divine. "Die Pup hat gesprochen," says a young German. Divine bursts out laughing. The crown of pearls falls to the floor and breaks. Condolences to which malicious joy gives rich tonalities. "The Divine is uncrowned. She's the great fallen one. Oh, the poor exile." The little pearls roll about the sawdust-covered floor. And these are like the glass pearls we thread every day on miles of brass wire, which, in other cells, they weave funeral wreaths like those that bestrewed the cemetery of my childhood, rusted, broken, weathered by wind and rain, with just a tiny little pink blue-winged porcelain angel attached to a thin blackened wire. In the cabaret, all the faggots are suddenly on their knees. Only the men stand upright. Then Divine lets out a burst of strident laughter. Everyone pricks up his ears. It's her signal. She tears her bridge out of her open mouth, puts it on her skull, and with her heart in her throat, but victorious, she cries out in a changed voice, with her lips drawn back into her mouth. "Damn it all, ladies! I'll be queen anyhow!" When I said that Divine was composed of a pure water, I ought to have made clear that she was hewn of tears. But making her gesture was a slight thing compared to the grandeur of soul required for the other, taking the bridge from her head, putting it back into her mouth, and fastening it on. And it was no slight matter for her to parody a royal coronation. When she was living with Ernestine in the Slate House, nobility is glamorous. The most equalitarian of men, though he may not care to admit it, experiences this glamour and submits to it. There are two possible attitudes toward it, humility or arrogance, both of which are explicit recognition of its powers. Titles are sacred. The sacred surrounds and enslaves us. It is the submission of flesh to flesh. The church is sacred. Its slow rites weighed down with gold like Spanish galleons, ancient in meaning, remote from spirituality, give it an empire as earthly as that of beauty and that of nobility. Que la foi of the light body, unable to escape this potency, abandoned himself to it voluptuously, as he would have done to art, had he known it. The nobility has names as heavy and strange as the names of snakes, already as difficult as the names of old lost divinities, strange as signs and escutcheons, or venerated animals, totems of old families, war cries, titles, furs, enamels, escutcheons that close the family with a secret, as a signet seals a parchment, an epitaph, a tomb. It charmed the child. Its processions in time, indistinct and yet certain and present, a procession of rough warriors, of whom he was, so he thought, the final issue. Therefore, they themselves, a procession whose sole reason for being had been to arrive at the following result: a pale child, prisoner of a village of thatched cottages, moved him more than an actual and visible procession of weather-beaten soldiers, of whom he might have been chief. But he was not noble. Nobody in the village was noble. At any rate, nobody bore the traces of nobility. But one day, among the rubbish in the attic, he found an old history book by Cabaret. In it were recorded 1,000 names of barons and knights-at-arms, but he saw only one: Picquigny. Ernestine's maiden name was Picquigny. No doubt about it, she was noble. We quote the passage from Monsieur Kepfig's Constitutionnel and Administrative History of France, page 447. A preliminary and secret meeting of the estates, which was organized by Marcel and the municipal magistrates of Paris. It was carried out as follows. Jean de Picquigny and several other men-at-arms went to the castle where the King of Navarre was held captive. Jean de Picquigny was governor of Artois. The men-at-arms, who were burghers of Amiens, set up ladders under the walls and took the guards by surprise, but they did not harm. End quote. In order to get precise information about this family, he read all through Capifigue's history. Had they been available, he would have ransacked libraries, worked his way through books of grammaire, and that is how scholarly vocations are born. But all he discovered was that islet emerging from a sea of glamorous names. But then, why didn't Ernestine have a nobiliary particle in her name? Where was her coat of arms? Indeed, what was her coat of arms? Did Ernestine know of this passage in the book and of her own nobility? Had he been less young and dreamy, Coulafroid would have noticed that the quarter of page 447 had been worn away by the sweat of fingers. Ernestine's father had known the book. The same miracle had opened it at the same place and had shown him the name. It pleased Coulafroid that the nobility belonged to Ernestine rather than to himself. And in this trait we may already see a sign of his destiny. To be able to approach her, to enjoy her intimacy, her special favors, was agreeable to him just as many persons are more pleased to be the favorite of a prince than the prince himself, or a priest of a god than the god, for in this way they can receive grace. Coulafroid could not keep from telling about his discovery, and not knowing how to raise the question with Ernestine, he blurted it out to her. "You're noble. I saw your name in an old history of France." He was smiling ironically, so as to give the impression of scorning the aristocracy, the vanity of which our schoolmaster spoke of sumptuously whenever reference was made in class to the night of August 4th. Coulafroid thought that scorn indicates indifference. Children, and particularly her own children, intimidated Ernestine almost as much as a servant intimidates me. She blushed and thought she had been found out, or thought she had been found out and blushed. I don't know which. She, too, wanted to be noble. She had put the question to her father, who had blushed in the same way. This history must have been in the family for a long time, playing as best it could the role of title of nobility, and perhaps it was Ernestine who, exhausted by a lavish imagination that made of her an impoverished countess, a marquise, or even several, all of them laden with blasons and crowns, had relegated it to the attic, out of her sight, in order to escape its magic. But she did not realize that in placing it above her head, she would never be able to free herself from it, the only effective means being to bury it in loamy earth, or to drown it, or burn it. She did not reply, but could Coulafroid have read within her, he would have seen the ravages wrought there merely by that unrecognized nobility, of which she was uncertain and which, in her eyes, put her above the villagers and the tourists from the cities. She described the blason, for she was now familiar with heraldry. She had gone all the way to Paris to ferret in Deosier's genealogy. She had learned history from it. As we have said, scholars hardly act otherwise, or from other motives. The philologist does not admit, besides he doesn't realize it, that his taste for etymology comes from the poetry. So he thinks, or might think, for it is a carnal potency that incites him, contained in the word esclave, slave, in which are found, if he likes, the word clé, key, and the word genou, knee. It is because a young man one day learns that the female scorpion devours her male that he becomes an entomologist. And another becomes a historian because he happens to read that Frederick II of Germany made children be brought up in solitude. Ernestine tried to avoid the shame of this confession, her lust for nobility, by the quick confession of a less infamous sin. This is an old trick, the trick of partial confessions. Spontaneously, I confess a little, the better to keep more serious things hidden. The examining magistrate told my lawyer that if I were putting on an act, I was giving a great performance, but I didn't put it on throughout the investigation. I multiplied errors of defense, and it was lucky I did. The court clerk looked as though he thought I was simulating ingenuousness, which is the mother of blunders. The judge seemed rather inclined to accept my sincerity. They were both wrong. It is true that I drew attention to compromising details that they had been unaware of. A number of times I said, "It was at night," a circumstance that aggravated my case, as the judge told me, though he also thought that a crafty delinquent would not have confessed this. I therefore must have been a novice. It was in the judge's chambers that it occurred to me to say that it was at night, for there were things about that night that I had to keep hidden. I had already thought of parrying the accusation with a new offense, namely nighttime, but since I had left no trace, I attached no importance to it. Then the importance shot up and grew. I don't know why. And I said mechanically, "At night," mechanically, but insistently. But during a second interrogation, I suddenly realized that I was not confusing facts and dates sufficiently. I was calculating and foreseeing with a rigor that disconcerted the judge. It was all too clever. I had only my own case to think about, but he had 20. So he questioned me, not about the things he ought to have examined and would have, had he been shrewder or had more time, and about which I planned my answers, but rather obvious details to which I hadn't given a thought because it hadn't occurred to me that a judge might think of them. Ernestine did not have time enough to invent a crime. She described the coat of arms. "It's argent and azure of 10 pieces. Overall, a lion gules, membered and langed. On the crest, Melusina. It was the arms of the Lusignans." Coulefoy listened to the splendid poem. Ernestine had at her fingertips the history of this family, which numbered kings of Jerusalem and princes of Cyprus. Their castle in Brittany was supposed to have been built by Melusina, but Ernestine did not dwell on this. It was in the legend and her mind, in order to build the unreal wanted solid materials. Legend is twaddle. She did not believe in fairies, who are creatures fabricated for the purpose of diverting dreamers of bold allegories from their straight path. But she had great thrills when she came across a historic phrase, quote, "the overseas branch, the singing arms," end quote. She knew she was lying. In trying to make herself illustrious through an ancient lineage, she was succumbing to the call of darkness, of the earth, of the flesh. She was seeking roots. She wanted to feel, trailing at her feet, the dynastic force which was brutal, muscular, fecundating. In effect, the heraldic figures illustrated it.